Montana Territory, July 1883. The dry wind whipped over the high plains outside Miles City the morning the stagecoach rolled in, dust trailing like smoke from its wheels. The horses were lathered and panting. The driver barely had time to tie them off before the door flung open and a young woman stumbled out, boots hitting the dirt with a thud. Her bonnet slipped sideways and her gloved hand trembled as it reached for balance. She took 2 steps and collapsed face first into the street. Henry Prescott had just stepped out of the blacksmith shop across the way, wiping soot from his arms with a rag. He dropped it instantly and ran. "Someone get the doc," he shouted, already kneeling beside her. She was burning up. Her skin was flushed, curls of damp brown hair stuck to her cheek and her breath rattled like dry leaves. He turned her gently. Her eyelids fluttered, but she did not speak. He could see she was young, maybe 20 or so, and well-dressed under the trail dust, though her skirt was torn at the hem. "The doc's out in Ash Creek," someone called. "Won't be back till Thursday." Henry looked down at her again. She was barely conscious and her lips were cracked from thirst. "I'll take her," he said, lifting her into his arms. "She needs rest and water now, not 2 days from now." No one argued. Folks in town knew Henry quiet, gentle, good with horses and better with people. He had lived alone since his parents passed, kept to himself mostly, but no one had ever seen him turn away a soul in need. He brought her to his cabin just outside of town. It was modest, 1-room, wood stove, bed in the corner but clean and quiet. He laid her down, stripped the dusty layers from her carefully and covered her with a quilt. Her name was stitched inside her valise, Margaret Thorne. He soaked a rag and pressed it to her forehead. Her fever was high and she tossed in her sleep, muttering things he could not make out. That night, he lit a candle and stayed by her side. When she coughed, he lifted her head and helped her drink water. When she whimpered, he whispered, "You are safe here." He sat by the bed in a wooden chair and did not sleep. The candle burned low, his eyes never leaving her face. By the second day, the fever had her fully. She thrashed and cried out, her voice raw. She whispered names: Sarah, Samuel. "I am sorry." And Henry's heart clenched. He did not ask questions. He just sat with her, holding her hand through the worst of it. By the 3rd day, the fever broke. She slept heavily, breath even. He let out a long breath himself and leaned back in the chair, rubbing his face. His hand still held hers. That evening, her eyes slowly opened. She blinked at the ceiling, then turned her head toward him. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said softly. "In Miles City. You collapsed outside the stagecoach depot." She tried to sit up, but fell back with a wince. "Careful," he said, moving to help her. "You have been sick with fever. You are safe now." Her eyes searched his face. You have been here the whole time," he nodded. "You needed watching, no doctor in town." She stared at him a long moment. Her voice shook when she spoke again. "I ran away from a wedding. I was meant to marry a man in Helena. My father arranged it. I did not even know his name until the week before." Henry did not answer right away. He could see the weight she carried in her eyes. "I am not going back," she whispered. "I would rather die in a ditch than be bought like livestock." "Well," he said, "you will not die, not while I can help it." She looked at his hand still resting on hers. She did not pull away. The next few days passed quiet. Margaret grew stronger, sitting up, sipping broth. Henry left only to tend to the horses and bring her books from town. She watched him with quiet eyes as he moved around the cabin, his easy strength, the way he cooked without fuss, how he never asked for thanks. One night, she sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket. The candle flickered near her shoulder. Henry was fixing a saddle strap at the table. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. He looked up. "Because you needed help." "That is all," he hesitated. I do not like seeing people suffer, and something in your eyes. It looked like pain I have seen before." She turned back to the window, her voice softer now. "I had 2 younger siblings, Sarah and Samuel. They died of fever when I was 16. I kept thinking I was going to die too, and I would see them again." Henry stood and walked over. He knelt beside her chair and gently took her hand again. "You are alive," he said. "You made it." She looked at him, and this time she did not look away. The next morning she helped him feed the horses, her steps still a bit slow. He showed her how to loop the reins over the post, and she laughed when the old mare nuzzled her hand for oats. "You are good with animals," she said. He smiled. "They are easier than people sometimes." She was quiet a moment, then said, "You are easy to be around." So he stayed beside her that day and the next as she grew stronger and her laughter came easier. He had not planned to feel anything for her, but it had happened quietly, like grass growing between stones. And he saw something in her eyes now, too, something softer, something that looked a little like trust. They were sitting on the porch late one afternoon when she reached for his hand. "I do not know what comes next," she said, "but I feel safe here, with you." He looked at her, the sun dipping behind the hills, and said softly, "You can stay if you want to." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in a long while neither of them felt alone. By the time August settled over the plains, the air was dry as flint and the grasses brittle beneath the horses' hooves. Margaret had taken to walking farther each morning, her steps still measured but no longer cautious. She wore one of Henry's old flannel shirts over her plain dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair braided down her back. The fever had stripped her down to something quieter, truer. She stood near the paddock, watching him mend a fence rail that had cracked in the night. The hammer moved in clean, steady arcs, and she found herself tracing the rhythm of his work without meaning to. "I've been thinking about what to do," she said when he paused to wipe his brow. He set the hammer down and looked over. "You don't owe me a decision." "I know," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, "but I want to make one." He leaned on the rail, nodding once. "I was raised to believe a woman's worth came from where she married who she married. I didn't question it much. Not until it was staring me in the face and I couldn't breathe." "You ever think of going back east?" he asked. "I thought I might, but then I remembered how it felt to be watched all the time like a hen in a market pen. I don't want that again." He didn't press her. She liked that about him, that he let silence stretch when it needed to. "So I was thinking," she went on, "about teaching. I can read and write as well as any schoolmistress, maybe better. There's a one-room schoolhouse in town, boarded up since last spring." He nodded slowly. "Was closed after the teacher married and moved to Butt. You talked to the council?" "I will. But I wanted to know if you thought it was foolish." He looked at her long enough that she shifted her weight. Then he said, "You don't strike me as someone who does much foolishly." She smiled, not shy, but like someone who'd just been seen clearly for the first time. That evening, she cooked supper: boiled potatoes with salt pork and onions, and they ate on the porch, side by side. The sun bled orange across the hills, and the scent of sagebrush drifted in from the open land. "I never asked what brought you out here," she said, folding her hands over her plate. "I was born here," he replied. "Left for a while, rode with a freight outfit down toward Wyoming. But I came back when my father took sick. He passed 2 winters ago, mother before that." She glanced over, her voice quiet. "You stayed on alone," seemed better than the noise of other places. She didn't answer, but her hand reached out, fingers brushing his as they rested on the edge of the plate. "I never knew anyone like you," she said. "Everything about you is steady." He shook his head. "I've known fear. I've known grief. I just stopped running from them." She turned her hand over, palm against his now. "I think I came all this way to learn something like that." The next morning she rose before dawn. Through the open door he saw her walking toward the barn, hair still loose, shawl wrapped tight. He followed after a few minutes, boots crunching over the dry grass. Inside, she was brushing the old mare's coat, slow and even. She didn't look up when he stepped in. "I had a dream," she said. "I was standing in my father's parlor again, lace gloves on, and I couldn't speak. Not a word. My mouth was sewn shut. When I woke, I came out here. I wanted to feel something alive." He walked closer, stopping just behind her. "You're not that girl anymore." "No," she said softly. "She was a ghost. I think I buried her somewhere near the stage depot." The mare snorted gently, nudging her shoulder. She laughed, and it broke the heaviness in the air like a window opened after storm. Later that week, she walked into town and returned with ink-stained fingers and a folded letter from the town council. She handed it to Henry without a word. He read, then looked up. "They offered you the position," she nodded. "Start in September. I'll need to scrub the place out, order some primers." He handed the letter back with a slow smile. "You'll be good at it." That night, she sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, sorting through a stack of readers and slates she'd brought home. He sat nearby, carving a new handle for her school bell from a cedar limb. "You ever think about marriage?" she asked without looking up. He didn't answer right away. "Not since my mother passed. I figured it wasn't for me." She set down the slate. "And now," he looked at her then, really looked. Her hands smudged with chalk, her brow drawn in focus, the way she sat like she belonged to the room. "I think about it differently." She stood, brushed off her skirt, and came to sit beside him. Her hand settled on his knee. "Would it be strange," she said, "if I asked to stay beyond autumn?" He took her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. "It'd be strange if you didn't." The first frost came early that year, clinging to the fence posts like breath held too long. By then, Margaret had been teaching for nearly 4 weeks, her days marked by the scratch of chalk and the hum of young voices reciting verses. The boarded windows of the schoolhouse had been pried open, dust swept out, and desks scrubbed until the grain showed through. She wore a wool shawl now, dyed deep green, and pinned her hair in a twist that stayed even through the wind. Henry drove her into town before sunrise each morning, the two of them wrapped in quiet, watching the pale light stretch across the prairie. He didn't speak much on those drives, but she'd come to understand the language of his silences. They were never cold. One evening, after the last child had gone and she'd locked the schoolhouse door, she found him waiting at the hitching post. He stood beside the wagon, hat in hand, his eyes drawn toward the west where the clouds rolled low and gray. She climbed up beside him. "There's a family from Red Lodge passed through today," he said as he took the reins. "Stopped by the smithy to ask after work. Said they'd heard the railroad might be laying new track near Forsyth." "Did they have children?" she asked, settling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "2 boys. One missing a boot." Woman had the look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. She was quiet, the cold wind tugging at her cheekbones. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "If the railroad comes through, more families will settle. I could send to St. Paul for more readers. Maybe even arithmetic slates." Henry glanced at her. "You planning on staying long enough to see them used?" She turned toward him, her expression unreadable in the half-light. "I wouldn't keep asking myself that if the answer weren't already clear." They rode the rest of the way in silence, the sort that settled between people who no longer needed to fill space with words. That night, she found him in the barn brushing down the gelding. The air was heavy with hay and the scent of oiled leather. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I've been offered lodging in town," she said. "Mrs. Larson has a spare room," his hand stilled on the horse's flank. "You thinking of taking it?" I told her I'd think on it. He returned to the brushing, slow and measured. "I'd miss our mornings," she added. "You wouldn't have to." She stepped into the barn, her boots muffled by the straw. "I'd also miss supper, and the way the stove creaks when it warms up. And the porch swing." He set the brush down and turned toward her. She didn't move. "You've never asked me to stay," she said. "I didn't want you to feel kept," he said. "You ran from a man who tried to buy your obedience. I figured you'd had enough men deciding your place." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "There's a difference between being kept and being chosen." He looked at her, and this time she didn't look away. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. They stood there among the horses and dust, the lantern light casting long shadows behind them. A week later, she unpacked her few belongings into the chest at the foot of his bed. She hung her dresses beside his coats, and in the drawer beside the stove, she tucked her sewing kit beside his fire striker. Nothing was said about permanence. It didn't need to be. On a Sunday afternoon, after the last of the snow had melted from the eaves, she found him repairing a broken wheel behind the barn. She watched him a while before speaking. "I wrote to my aunt in Illinois," she said. He glanced up, wiping his hands. "She the one with the piano?" She offered to send it west, said it's been gathering dust since her girls married. He raised an eyebrow. "You play enough to teach a child a tune, not enough to impress anyone." He smiled faintly. "We've got room for a piano." I measured the corner near the window. It'd fit just fine. He nodded, and she knew that meant yes. That spring, she planted a row of hollyhocks along the side of the cabin. He built her a bench beneath the window. On warm evenings, they sat there as the sky softened, her head resting against his shoulder, their hands folded together without thought. They didn't talk about the past anymore. It had done its damage, but it no longer ruled them. Now they spoke of fences and books, of the children who brought her pressed flowers and the mare that would likely foal before summer's end. One night, as they lay beneath the quilt, the lamp turned low, she traced her fingers along the curve of his palm. "You think we'll ever be old?" she asked. His voice was quiet in the dark. "If we're lucky." "I want to grow old with you," she said. "You will," he answered, and she believed him. By late April, the cottonwoods along the creek behind the cabin had begun to leaf out, pale green flickers against the still cold sky. Margaret stood beneath them one morning, skirts damp at the hem from the dew, watching the water shift around stones. Her fingers curled around the twig of a willow branch, absently stripping it of its young leaves. Henry stepped down from the porch and joined her. She didn't turn until he was beside her. "School's out for 2 weeks," she said, voice low. "Spring lambing. Most of the children won't come, even if I open the doors." "You thinking of going somewhere?" he asked. She shook her head. "I was thinking we haven't ridden beyond the butte since the snow melted." He nodded once, and that afternoon they saddled the horses and rode northeast, following the river until the land rose into rolling bluffs. The grass was patchy still, but the air was warming, and the sky held that particular color just after the last storm had passed, washed clean and almost blue enough to drink. They stopped near a low ridge where the ground broke into shale, and the wind hadn't yet carried off the scent of last summer's sage. Margaret slid down first, fixing her hat with one hand as she looked out across the widespread basin. "I used to think the world stopped past the edge of Charleston," she said. He tied off the reins and came to stand beside her. "And now," she crouched, brushing her hand across the brittle wildflowers just beginning to wake from winter. "Now it feels like it goes on forever. I don't know how I spent 18 years without knowing how the land sounds when it breathes." They sat on a flat stone overlooking the valley. The horses grazed nearby, tails flicking. For a long stretch, neither of them spoke. She broke the silence. "My mother used to tell me I'd marry a banker. Said my hands were too soft for anything else." Henry leaned back on his elbows, boots stretched out in front of him. "You've got calluses now." "I do," she said, "and I'm proud of them." The wind tugged at her braid and she let it, eyes half lidded against the sun. "You ever wanted children?" she asked after a while. He blinked, then sat up, brushing grit from his palms. "I grew up thinking I'd have a few, never gave it much weight once I got older, figured it wasn't in the cards." She was watching his face, steady and quiet. "I think I would," she said. "But I'd want them raised like this, with sky and dirt and truth." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "If you wanted that, I'd want it too." She reached for his hand, fingers threading through his. They rode back in the purple hush of evening, the horses plodding slow as if they too felt the weight of the day. When they reached the cabin, Margaret lit the lamp while Henry stirred embers in the stove back to flame. She crossed to the shelf near the window and opened a small tin box, pulling out an envelope. She held it out to him. "I wrote to my father," she said. He looked at the envelope, then at her. "I didn't ask for anything," she added. "I just told him I was well. That I'd made a life." "You want him to write back?" "I don't know," she said. "I just didn't want silence to be the last thing between us." Henry took the letter and laid it gently on the table. Then that's enough. That night she curled beneath the quilt with her head resting against his shoulder. Rain began to fall, soft and steady, tapping against the roof like a lullaby. She spoke into the hush. "I'm not afraid of what's next." He turned, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You don't have to be. We'll meet it together." And when she closed her eyes, her hand resting over his heart, she believed him. By mid-June, the prairie turned gold around the edges, and the last of the lambs had found their legs. Margaret walked barefoot through the creek most evenings, skirts pinned above her ankles, her laughter drifting through the cottonwoods when the cold water surprised her. She'd taken to writing lesson plans on the porch after supper, pencil tucked behind her ear, feet drawn up beneath her. Henry often sat nearby, carving or oiling tack, both of them content in the hush that settled when words weren't needed. One Saturday, she returned from town with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and a quiet look about her. "I stopped by the mercantile," she said, setting the package on the table. He didn't ask until she untied the string and pulled out a bolt of cream muslin and a narrow tin of pearl buttons. "I thought I might sew something," she said, fingers smoothing the cloth. He looked at her. "For the schoolchildren," she hesitated. "For me." "For a day that matters." The meaning sat between them like a held breath. "I can talk to Reverend Sims," he said. "If you want that," she nodded slowly. "Not a grand thing, just something honest." They agreed on a date 3 weeks ahead when the hay would be laid in and the summer break begun. Margaret wrote to her aunt again, not for permission but because it felt right. She didn't expect a reply. That Sunday morning dawned clear, cicadas buzzing low in the scrub. Margaret wore a dress she'd sewn herself, the muslin falling in clean lines, a sprig of yarrow pinned at the collar. Her hair was braided and coiled, not for show but to keep it off her neck in the heat. Henry stood beside her in a crisp shirt and his best waistcoat, the one with the faint moth bite near the hem. Neither said much as they hitched the wagon and headed into Miles City. The wedding was held behind the schoolhouse, under the shade of a cottonwood tree that had stood since before the town had a name. Mrs. Larson brought a pie. The blacksmith's wife came with a small bouquet of wild iris. Reverend Sims spoke plainly, his words spare and firm, and when he asked if Margaret took Henry's hand in the building of a life, she answered yes without hesitation. Afterward, they shared bread and pickled beans and a jug of lemonade. The children gave her a bundle of drawings tied with twine, and one shy boy handed Henry a pebble he'd found shaped like a heart. Henry tucked it into his coat pocket without a word. That evening, back at the cabin, Margaret stood barefoot in the doorway, watching the last of the light catch in the grasses. "I didn't think I'd marry again," she said softly, arms folded beneath her ribs. "You didn't," Henry replied, stepping behind her. "You married for the first time." She leaned back into him, her head settling beneath his chin. They didn't speak again that night, not through supper, not as they folded the quilt back on the bed. The silence between them had shifted, no longer cautious, but rooted. When they lay down, it was with the weightless certainty of people who had come through fire and found, at last, something that could not be burned away. By late July, the piano arrived, delivered in a freight wagon from Billings. Margaret sat on the bench that first afternoon, dusting its keys with a handkerchief, then played a halting tune she remembered from childhood. Henry leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, listening. "You'll teach the children?" he asked when she paused. "I'll teach ours first," she said, her smile quiet and full. That winter, the cabin held more warmth than it ever had. Henry added a second room, hammering through the cold while Margaret read aloud from a book of folk tales. She sewed small garments in the evenings, each stitch pulling her farther from the girl she'd once been measured, watched, afraid and closer to the woman she'd become. When their daughter was born the following spring, the prairie bloomed early. The child came in the soft hours before dawn, her cry strong and clear. Margaret held her close, fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "She's got your steadiness," she whispered. Henry sat beside them, one hand resting on the quilt, the other beneath the tiny fist that had latched onto his finger. "She's got your fire," he said. They named her Clara after the creek that ran behind the cabin, quiet and constant. Years passed, and the schoolhouse filled again. Margaret taught Clara her letters at the kitchen table, while Henry built a small barn out back for the growing herd. The piano was played often, sometimes with 3 small fingers at once, and the cabin walls never heard silence for long. One autumn morning, Henry found a letter tucked between the pages of a book Margaret had left on the porch. It was from her father. The handwriting was older, unsteady. "I was wrong," it said. "I see that now. If you ever find it in your heart to write again, I would be honored to know your family." Margaret read it once, then set it aside. She didn't speak of it for days. Then one evening, as they watched Clara chase grasshoppers near the fence, she said softly, "He's a man made by a world I escaped. I don't need him to be more than that." Henry pressed her hand in his. "He doesn't define you." "I know," she said. "He never did." They lived long and well. The years shaped them, lines deepened, hair silvered, but the love between them never frayed. It was built on small things. The way he warmed her tea before she woke, the way she mended his cuffs without being asked, the way they still reached for each other in sleep. On their 20th anniversary, Clara played them a song she'd written herself. The notes were halting, but the love in them rang clear. Afterward, Margaret leaned her head against Henry's shoulder, the firelight flickering gold across their faces. "We did all right," she said. He kissed her temple, his voice steady as ever. "We did more than that." And they never had to run again. Not from fear, not from silence, not from the past. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, had chosen peace. Their life was not grand, but it was full, and it was theirs.